He didn't look like a nightmare. In fact, to most who passed him on the busy streets of New York, Albert Fish seemed almost forgettable. An aging man with a quiet demeanor and eyes that never lingered long enough to draw suspicion. But behind that frail frame was a mind carrying thoughts that few could imagine, and even fewer would dare to confront. Here at Abstract Pulse, we don't just tell the story, we ask why. Why some lives twist into darkness, and what that darkness says about the world that surrounds it. Monsters like Albert Fish don't appear in a vacuum. They grow from the soil of human experience, watered by neglect, trauma, and sometimes by the indifference of the society around them. We'll explore this case not only through the crimes themselves, but through the behaviors, choices, and patterns that shaped him. This is not a diagnosis. We're not psychiatrists, and we can't pretend to know the exact workings of another person's mind. What follows is an exploration, based on historical records, psychological research, and comparisons to similar cases, of what might drive a man to become the figure parents warned their children about. Before the name Albert Fish would burn itself into headlines and court records, he was simply another face in the crowd. A man shaped by a world that had already left its scars on him long before he began leaving scars of his own. His story begins decades before the city would know fear by his presence. In a childhood filled with abandonment, instability, and the seeds of an obsession that would grow in the shadows for years. The streets of turn-of-the-century New York were restless, crowded, and unkind to those who had little. Families struggled to keep food on the table, children wandered alleys barefoot, and charity was scarce. For some, those streets bred resilience. For others, they bred something far more dangerous. It was in this world that Fish first learned what cruelty looked like, and how it could be mistaken for care. In the chapters ahead, we'll trace the life of a man who would come to embody the city's deepest fears, beginning not with his crimes, but with the broken beginnings that helped shape them. Albert Fish entered the world in 1870, and almost immediately the world began taking pieces of him. His father was 59 when Fish was born, an age when most men were preparing for the quiet of old age, not raising an infant. His mother, much younger, struggled to hold the family together in a city already brimming with hardship. When Fish was just 5 years old, his father died, leaving the family with little more than debts and instability. Unable to provide for all her children, his mother placed young Albert in an orphanage, a decision that would leave a mark deeper than she could have imagined. The orphanage was not a place of refuge. It was a place where cruelty was routine, where discipline was delivered through pain, and where humiliation was a daily ritual. The children were beaten, often for the smallest perceived offense, and in that atmosphere of constant violence, Fish learned something dangerous. He began to associate pain with a strange kind of comfort. This is one of the earliest patterns psychologists point to when examining his life. Prolonged exposure to abuse during formative years can distort the brain's relationship with fear, pain, and control. In Fish's case, it wasn't just that he learned to endure suffering, he began to seek it out. The orphanage had not broken him in the way it intended. Instead, it taught him to survive by bending toward the cruelty rather than resisting it. By the time his mother regained enough stability to take him back, the damage was already set deep in his mind. He was a quiet child, but quiet in the way that suggested something hidden, not absent. He'd been introduced to an idea that there was a twisted intimacy and hurt, and it would remain with him for the rest of his life. As the years went on, Fish's behavior grew increasingly strange. He developed odd fascinations, small at first, that hinted at the darker compulsions still forming beneath the surface. In another world, with different influences, perhaps those seeds would have remained buried. But in the streets of New York, in the late 19th century, there was no shortage of shadows for them to grow in. By his late teens, the strange behaviors Albert Fish had kept hidden since the orphanage were beginning to take form in the open, and they were impossible to mistake for harmless eccentricities. Neighbors and acquaintances recalled unsettling encounters with the young man. There were whispers of him luring children into alleys with coins or candy, only to torment them before letting them go. These weren't idle rumors. Decades later, several now-grown victims would testify to the same pattern, their memories of him frozen in time by fear. Animal cruelty also became a consistent thread in Fish's private life. According to later reports and his own confessions, he would capture stray cats and dogs, inflicting harm with a detached precision that echoed the beatings he'd endured as a child. This is a behavioral marker seen in many serial offenders, a way to practice control and violence without facing immediate consequences. For Fish, it was rehearsal. By the 1890s, he had begun visiting public bathhouses, not for bathing, but for the opportunity to watch young boys undress. This voyeurism escalated into following them home, learning their routines, and in some cases, approaching them with propositions that blurred the line between harassment and abduction. The city's fragmented police system and lack of centralized records meant these incidents never connected into a single, alarming profile. It was during this period that Fish's fascination with physical pain, both inflicting and receiving it, became more ritualistic. He developed practices that combined self-harm with sadistic fantasies about others, often framing them in the language of religious sacrifice. These rituals were not impulsive. He prepared for them, carried tools, and wrote about them in ways that suggested they were as important to him as the acts themselves. To the outside world, he was still just a quiet, peculiar man drifting from job to job. But those who crossed paths with him in the wrong moment saw something else. A figure who seemed to take pleasure in fear itself. The same patterns that psychologists now call part of the serial killer triad: cruelty to animals, obsession with fire, and predatory behavior toward children, were all present. Fish wasn't just developing fantasies, he was already living pieces of them, waiting for the moment he could escalate without restraint. On a warm June afternoon in 1928, Albert Fish walked into the lives of the Budd family. He had seen a classified ad placed by 18-year-old Edward Budd, offering his labor as a farmhand. Fish arrived at their modest Manhattan home under the guise of being a wealthy farmer named Frank Howard. His manner was polite, even grandfatherly, and the Budds welcomed him in without suspicion. Fish claimed he intended to hire Edward, but as the visit went on, his attention drifted to Edward's younger sister, 10-year-old Grace. By the end of the conversation, he had convinced the Budds to let Grace accompany him to a birthday party for his niece. He promised she'd be returned that evening. Grace left the house in a white dress, smiling. She was never seen alive again. The truth, revealed years later in one of Fish's own letters, was far from the story he told that day. Instead of taking Grace to a celebration, he led her to an abandoned house in Westchester County. There, his carefully constructed facade fell away. In his letter to Mrs. Budd, he described luring Grace upstairs, overpowering her, and committing acts of violence so extreme that even seasoned investigators found them difficult to read. The letter's language was precise, almost formal, as though he were recounting an obligation rather than a crime. That letter would become one of the most infamous pieces of evidence in American criminal history. It was not only a confession, but a detailed timeline of the murder, written years after the fact. Experts noted how his recollection showed no sign of remorse, only satisfaction in retelling it. Forensic psychologists pointed out that this was consistent with his earlier behavior. The act itself wasn't enough. He needed to preserve and relive it through narrative. Grace's body was eventually found in the house where Fish had taken her, partially concealed and bearing the marks of what had been described in his letter. The brutality of the crime shocked even a city accustomed to violence. Newspapers called him the Gray Man and the Boogeyman, names that captured the paradox of his unassuming appearance and monstrous acts. In the years that followed, investigators would link Fish to other disappearances and murders, some predating Grace Budd's death by decades. But it was her case, the deception, the calculated abduction, and the cold detail in his confession that defined him in the public imagination. Grace Budd's murder became the focal point of a sprawling investigation. But Albert Fish's crimes reached far beyond that single day in 1928. Over the years, both through police work and his own chilling admissions, a pattern emerged, one that suggested decades of predation. Among the cases linked to Fish was the disappearance of 4-year-old Billy Gaffney in 1927. Witnesses reported seeing the boy in the company of an elderly man matching Fish's description, leading him away by the hand. Billy was never found, but in another of Fish's later letters, he described taking the child to a secluded location, binding him, and committing acts that defy comprehension. The letter detailed not only the murder, but also the cannibalization of parts of the boy's body. Investigators would later verify certain physical details in the letter that only the killer could have known, lending credibility to the confession. Then, there was Francis McDonnell, a 9-year-old boy who vanished while playing outside his Staten Island home in 1924. His body was discovered hanging from a tree in a wooded area, strangled with his own suspenders. Witnesses again described seeing an older man, shabby, gray, and thin, loitering in the neighborhood in the days prior. While Fish denied involvement at first, he later admitted to the killing in a matter-of-fact tone, as if recounting a task completed long ago. These were not impulsive acts. In each case, Fish chose victims carefully. Children small enough to overpower, families who would not suspect him, locations that offered privacy. His methods blended deception, patience, and calculated cruelty. The cannibalism, while shocking to the public, was to him simply another facet of control. A final act that erased his victims completely, leaving nothing but memory. The scope of his crimes is still uncertain. Police believed there were other victims whose disappearances were never connected to him. Some of his claims were likely fabricated, as he seemed to enjoy weaving lies into his truths. But the confirmed cases alone were enough to place him among the most sadistic killers in American history. Despite his ability to vanish after each crime, Fish's arrogance eventually led to his downfall. The letter to Mrs. Budd contained a small but critical clue. The envelope bore a distinctive emblem from the New York Private Chauffeurs Benevolent Association, an organization whose stationery had been stolen from a rooming house. Detectives traced the stationery back to a man who had lived there, Albert Fish. On December 13, 1934, detectives confronted him at his lodgings. When asked to come to the station, Fish reportedly pulled a razor from his pocket. The officers subdued him quickly, and as he was led away, he offered no resistance, as if he had been expecting the moment all along. The hunt for the Boogeyman was over, but the horror of his crimes was only beginning to be fully understood. Albert Fish's trial began in March 1935 at the Westchester County Courthouse. The courtroom was filled each day with reporters, curious citizens, and the families of victims, all drawn by the notoriety of the man now labeled the Boogeyman. The prosecution focused heavily on the Grace Budd murder, using his letter as both confession and proof of premeditation. The defense argued insanity, citing his history of self-harm, sadomasochism, and delusional religious beliefs. Fish himself took the stand, calmly recounting acts of violence as though they were mundane memories. He admitted to hearing the voice of God urging him to kill, describing his crimes in precise, almost clinical language. To the jury, it was clear. Whether or not he believed his own justifications, he had known exactly what he was doing. After 11 days of testimony, the verdict came quickly. The jury found him guilty of first-degree murder. Despite the insanity plea, they determined he was legally sane at the time of the crime. The sentence was death by electrocution. On January 16, 1936, Albert Fish was executed at Sing Sing Prison. Witnesses reported that he entered the execution chamber without resistance, speaking little. For some, that was the final justice. For others, it was a far too brief end to a lifetime of horror. But the question that lingers is one no court can answer. How does a human being become something like Albert Fish? Was it the cruelty of his childhood, the absence of love, the lack of intervention from a society that turned away from the vulnerable? Or was that darkness always there, waiting for the right conditions to grow? We like to think evil is an outside force, something separate from us. But Fish's life is a reminder that monsters are made from the same raw materials as everyone else. The wrong mix of environment, trauma, and unchecked desire, and reality bends into something unrecognizable. Maybe the most unsettling thought is this: we can map every step of his life, trace every crime, and still never truly understand why. Perhaps that's the final truth, that some corners of the human mind are unreachable, and the darkness that lives there is beyond our full comprehension. And so ends the story of Albert Fish, a man whose name became a warning, a myth, and a reminder of how thin the line is between ordinary and monstrous. Darkness leaves a mark, but so does the light of those who refuse to look away. Thank you for joining us on this journey into one of the most disturbing cases in American history. If you found this deep dive engaging, consider subscribing to Abstract Pulse for more true crime stories told through the lens of psychology, philosophy, and the eerie realities of human behavior. Hit the bell to stay notified, follow us on our socials, and share this with others who aren't afraid to explore the shadows. Until next time,